So almost a year ago, I walked away from my job where I was global head of talent for a systematic trading fund. And it was a very good job, very, very cushy. And part of the reason I did this was because I realized that I was underutilized in my role and that I could do something similar for multiple companies whilst retaining independence and autonomy and ensuring that my income didn't really suffer in the transition. And I've noticed that fractional work is growing. And so I thought it would be a good idea to really kind of talk about it. So if you're somebody in mid-career, if you're somebody who is very experienced in a particular sphere, then you know that this is an option available to you and you don't necessarily have to suffer your way through full-time jobs. It's funny because when I tell people that I work fractionally, they typically assume that I'm a consultant, or that I couldn't get a real job. But that's not true. Fractional work isn't consulting. It's just a very different architecture. If you're senior and you're experienced and you're kind of tired of being underutilized in your role, or you want more autonomy, then this might be what you're looking for. So what I want to do in this video is I want to explain what fractional work is in more detail. I want to talk about how it's different from consultant work, for example. I want to share my own experience of going fractional. And I want to talk a little bit about where this model is headed. I think there's something really exciting around groups and collectives emerging or fractional executives. I think it's worth also helping you figure out if this is something that you'd like to explore for yourself. I guess the sort of caveat to note at the start is that fractional work is not for everybody. So you might hear this and be completely repulsed. That's completely fine. But if you hear this and you think, actually, this sounds interesting, I've been looking for something like this, then fantastic. So if we think about why fractional work is growing, I think there are a number of big shifts that have happened in the workplace over the past number of years. The first is that having one job is really operating in a model where your risk is concentrated. So if you have a really good boss or the company is going through a really fantastic spell, great. But if any of those things changes, then your personal circumstances change significantly. So I often hear people saying, yeah, I joined this company because my boss joined the company and brought me along. And then within a few months, that boss left the company and you're stuck, right? I think increasingly people are realizing that the world is such that so many things are changing quite frequently that it's really not worth concentrating your risk within one job and one company. But the other emerging sort of pattern is that a lot of professionals feel that they're outgrowing their full-time roles. So imagine being in a company where you've been for 5, 10 years, maybe you've ascended up the ranks and you're basically experiencing Groundhog Day because you're experiencing various iterations of the same problem over and over again. So for a lot of people, part of their discontent with their jobs comes from feeling that way in their current role. By moving to fractional, you're able to solve that problem because, you don't necessarily have to wait for someone to leave before you go up the next rung. You can work with different people, solve different types of problems, and still maintain your level of seniority and have an impact across multiple businesses. So from that perspective, it's quite attractive. The other aspect, if I look at it from the perspective of companies, a lot of companies are growing and need senior expertise, but aren't necessarily in the place where they need senior expertise full time. And if we look increasingly at the impact that AI has had on tech companies growing, we're expecting our first billion-dollar company with one employee to come over the next few years. And it's not uncommon to see companies of 10 people with an ARR in the millions. And so you can imagine that companies like that will need senior expertise to be able to sort of navigate their sort of pace of growth without necessarily needing to bring on someone in a full-time capacity. The last thing I talked about AI just now, but AI is definitely changing the way that value is created. A quieter trend, but one that's definitely accelerating is around AI automating execution. And so it means that things that people have been able to sort of do for many, many years, all of those things can now be sort of automated. So it then means that there's a lot more value in people who have experience and who have judgment, who have pattern recognition, who've got strategic thinking, who've got a high emotional quotient. All of those things are highly sought after. And these are the things that fractional professionals can bring to the table. You can kind of see how macro factors are influencing the sort of evolution of this type of work increasingly. I always like to talk about data. So in the US, there are now 68 million people who work independently in some capacity. And the fastest growing segment of this independent worker base isn't necessarily the gig workers. So think Uber, for example, where the a lot of the growth is with experienced professionals. And the biggest growth is in people who are making over $100,000 a year, not as a side hustle, but as their sort of main independent work. So over 6 million Americans are in this category of working independently, but making over $100,000 a year. And when you zoom in to fractional leadership specifically, fractional CFOs, fractional CTOs, CMOs, COOs, etc., that specific segment of fractional C-level executives grew by 30 to 40% between 2020 and 2023. And so you can see that there's a significant structural shift that is happening in the workplace when it comes to fractional work. On LinkedIn, the titles with the word fractional has doubled in the last 4 years. So, just be aware that this is definitely a direction that the industry overall is moving down. So, if I think about what is kind of driving the growth of fractional work, so one, we think about the number of startups and scale-ups in the tech sphere. A lot of these companies need C-suite talent. They really need the expertise. And having fractional workers gives them access to the sort of expertise that they probably won't be in a position to bring on board. The other thing is that sorry, I'm just kind of checking through my notes. Okay, fine. So that really helps. We've talked a little bit about the US. Let's talk about the UK now. I will say in the UK, I feel like the UK is lagging behind the US a little bit. We still use words like interim to describe senior level short-term work, and we still haven't kind of caught on to the sort of describing this work as fractional. So it's definitely less developed in the UK, but hopefully it's something that will grow over the next few years. I wouldn't say necessarily that the UK is behind on fractional talent. I just think it's behind on using the sort of modern language of describing that type of work and also the cultural acceptance for this. Oftentimes people literally treat interim work as interim work as opposed to a deliberate career direction. So hopefully that's something that will basically change soon. So we've talked a little bit about the macroeconomic factors that are driving fractional work. We've juxtaposed the US versus the UK. The US has definitely embraced it. This is an area that's seen a lot of significant growth. So let's talk a little bit about what fractional work actually is, because a lot of people tend to mistake it with consulting work. So if you think about this, if you're a senior level exec, maybe you're at the C-suite level or the VP level, and you have a specific area of expertise, you can offer that expertise to multiple companies at the same time on an ongoing basis, delivering the same level of expertise as you would if you were in a full-time job. For a lot of fractional professionals, they'll typically do it on the basis of, 1 day a week or however many days a week per client. And so, or sometimes there'll be a certain number of hours per month. The key thing with fractional work is that you're typically embedded into the businesses that you work with. You're accountable for specific outcomes. So, what you're not doing is selling hours, what you're doing is selling judgment and execution. So, you're giving companies the opportunity to benefit from your expertise. So I'll give an example with myself. So I'm a fractional head of talent. So I work with hedge funds, trading firms, prop trading firms, tech startups, usually a day or two a week or a month. And I'm not just advising them on hiring strategy. Um, I'm helping them to build their talent framework, upskill their recruiters and hiring managers when it comes to interviews. I'm running searches, I'm interviewing candidates, negotiating offers. So basically working across the full life cycle. Um, so one of the things I found is that because it's relatively new in the UK, a lot of my time is spent on educating my clients, educating, the teams that I work alongside about where, my remit sort of starts and stops as a fractional partner. So it's very interesting that, as somebody who's kind of one of many people kind of leading the charge in the UK, that there's an element of education that basically goes into it. If you're, for example, a fractional chief technology officer, you're probably going to be supporting with the tech strategy, potentially writing codes, setting tech direction, mentoring others, hiring engineers, making architectural decisions, etc. Right? So if you're a fractional CFO, you might be reviewing the financials, building the team, mentoring the team, working on cash flow projections, etc. So you're essentially operating in whatever sphere you would normally operate in a full-time job, just not in a full-time capacity. So let's talk a little bit about what fractional isn't, because I think that this is the area that a lot of people don't tend to get confused about. So if we juxtapose it with what a consultant does, for example, a consultant will typically be brought in to solve a specific problem. So they'll diagnose the problem, they'll analyze it, then they'll recommend what the solution is, and then they hand it over, right? So their deliverable is typically a report or a framework or a strategy document that their clients can use to implement what they've recommended, but they're not necessarily accountable for execution. And if you're a consultant, feel free to correct me here, right? This is just my understanding. What they're responsible for is the quality of their recommendations, and when the project ends, then they can basically wrap up. So you can see that that is definitely different to the work of a fractional executive, where you don't necessarily end when a project ends. You're there as long as you're adding value in the sort of in your area of expertise. If you think about the work that an advisor does, again, just to kind of juxtapose it with fractional work, an advisor provides strategic guidance. So you're the sounding board, you validate decisions, you bring perspective. Usually, this tends to be at board level, and it's typically light touch, right? These people who are in advisory roles aren't necessarily involved with the execution of the work. They're not in the weeds. So they tend to work at a very high level. But as a fractional professional, you're going to be executing, you own outcomes, you're accountable for results. You're definitely sometimes you're in the org chart, sometimes you're not. But you're part of the leadership team, and you're helping to make decisions, and you're helping to really move the work forward, and you stay as long as the business needs you to stay. So that's the distinction. If you have any additional color to add on what a fractional professional is, please feel free to add it in the comments as well. So um, if I if I share, I mean, I think when I think about my experience of kind of going fractional, it's been really good. I would say the key challenge has been setting boundaries around my work, because if you're not careful in fractional work, you can experience scope creep. And obviously, if you have your scope expanding unwittingly, then it impacts your ability to be able to do really good work for your other clients, and it just impacts your quality of life overall, because you'll have to work much longer to deliver on kind of what you've promised. So I would say that that's probably been the biggest thing to kind of wrap my head around, which is really kind of working on the scope creep. But I would say the value of doing fractional work is that you get freedom, although you have nowhere to hide, right? Because you're accountable, but you certainly have freedom and autonomy. If you're not good at what you do, it shows really quickly. If you can't manage yourself, it shows as well. But if you're clear on what you're good at, and you're comfortable with some element of uncertainty, and you genuinely want to do more work, you care more about the work than the title, then fractional work really works well for you. One of the things that has been interesting about getting more and more into this world of fractional work is I've come across the development of fractional groups and collectives, and this is where different fractional professionals with different areas of expertise come together as a group. So, for example, person A goes into a company as a fractional CFO, and the company needs a talent lead, and they bring in a talent lead from their collective, and etc. Right? So increasingly we're seeing that happening, which I think is a really fantastic way forward in the industry, because it means that you can offset working by yourself and having to find all of your fractional leads yourself, because you now have a group of people and you can do that for one another collectively. So that's an exciting kind of development in the industry. So I think fractional work in the UK is still in its early days. I expect it to grow, and I expect this to grow globally, just as the US has been leading the charge with that. So if you're a senior professional and you're thinking, you know what, I've outgrown my job, I no longer think I want to do this, but also I can't see myself going into other companies for a full-time job, because maybe you feel that you're at the pinnacle, right, of the work that you do, or you've just outgrown having to do a full-time job. And if fractional work is something that you're considering, there are a few things to think about. So I would say that fractional work is ideal if you're an experienced person. So a lot of people that get into fractional work have about 10 years plus of experience and a clear track record, because that means that they have credibility. Now, I'm not saying if you have less, you can't be a fractional professional, and I'm sure that there are nuances and there are always outliers, but generally speaking, fractional work tends to be about experience. So, companies want to bring in people that have a track record, have credibility, and they can hand over stuff to, and not feel that they need to kind of develop those people or watch over those people. I think people who are comfortable without titles or org charts or very kind of strict hierarchy tend to do well in a fractional role. So you don't necessarily need a VP or director title to feel validated in your work. If you care about that, then you might find fractional work painful because you get the authority, you get the responsibility, but you may or may not get the title. I think people who are very good at context switching between different businesses, between different types of work, will do well in a fractional role. Also, people who don't necessarily need daily validation or daily structure. So, no one is checking on whether you're doing a piece of work or not. You're accountable, so you've got to, have your own structure and be motivated. So, if you're that kind of person, then you'll do well as a fractional professional. I think if you're somebody who has pattern recognition in your industry, so you've got context in your industry, you've got really good pattern recognition, you understand what's happening and how it impacts the industry at large, but also specific companies, and you can bring that into your decision making, that works really well. And yeah, if you're somebody who enjoys autonomy, who enjoys variety, who enjoys flexibility, then fractional work could definitely be something that you go on to do. I think on the other end, fractional work might be harder if you're early career. Um, Also people who like structure, routine, people who like to be given a piece of work to do. Fractional work may not be for you. And also, if you're not in a place where you have a distinct skill set, if you're still trying to define what that is, then maybe you need to just kind of give it a bit of time until you consider doing fractional work. If you're somebody who is trying to go up the career ladder and you're chasing promotions and you're kind of seeking status, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But just consider that fractional work might not be for you. It might make more sense for you to be within an organization where you can pursue a specific career trajectory. So I would say that overall, fractional work works really well if you're somebody who's clear and solid in who you are and what you do, and you want to offer that to multiple companies rather than somebody who is kind of chasing ambition and status, etc. So I've talked a little bit about all the pluses of fractional work, the autonomy, the flexibility. You can still command a high income. You can work with the companies you want to work with, and you don't have to work with the companies you don't want to work with. All of those things are fantastic. But as with everything, there are trade-offs, right? So if I think about some of the trade-offs, it's that there's definitely income variability. So in an ideal world, you'd have companies banging down your door wanting to work with you. But the reality is that for most people, you've got to go find those companies. And particularly when you're starting out, there can be income variability there because you might not yet be known. Which is why I think visibility is really important, but that's a subject for another day. And so, whenever people are looking to move into fractional work, my advice is always give yourself a really, really substantial runway of savings, at least 6 to 12 months, so that you're in a position where you can really take your time and build out your client base. The other trade-off is that there are no benefits, right? So if you're working in a company, you have a set number of vacation days, you've got pension contributions, probably health insurance, etc. Here you don't, right? So you cover all of that for yourself. So it means that you're going to have to make your own plans for private healthcare or pension or etc. So these things are admin heavy, but I think even though it's a trade-off, I think ultimately it works out, right? Once you have a system in place. I mentioned this before, which is around boundary management. The scope creep I find the hardest because you want to do a good job. And in your day-to-day work, at least I've typically worked in an entrepreneurial environment in my full-time job, and working in entrepreneurial environments mean you just roll up your sleeve and do the work that needs to be done. So I found that really difficult because it's very easy to over deliver. You want to prove your value. You want your client to renew, and so it's very easy to work more days than what you're being paid for in a fractional role. So, I think one of the lessons is learning how to say no and how to properly define what the scope is so that your client is clear and you're clear and you know that you know what you're kind of working towards. I think the bit that most people will find difficult in fractional work is constantly having to sell yourself, constantly having to position yourself in the market, because ultimately, with fractional work, it has a beginning, middle, and an end point, right? And so projects do wrap up and budgets change. And so you're never done with business development. And if you're somebody who's uncomfortable with putting yourself out there or with selling, then fractional work would probably deplete you. You'll probably find it extremely exhausting. Now, if after a while you've kind of built up a reputation and you have a really good body of work behind you, you might not have to do as much business development. But as with everything, that takes time, right? So you kind of got to give it that time. If you're a sociable person, then fractional work can definitely be challenging because you have no default team unless you're part of a collective and you make an effort to work together. So there's a lot of, there's some loneliness there, right? So no one to debrief with at the end of the day. And, you're having no one to kind of bounce ideas off of unless you're able to do so with the clients that you have. So if you get energy around people, that can be really, really hard. So yeah, I would say that those are the main kind of trade-offs. And if you can think about any others, then definitely add them in the comments. But even with those trade-offs, if you're in a fractional role, you're diversifying your risk because you're not just putting all of your income generation in one role, you have multiple roles. You have options, so you can definitely shape your portfolio deliberately in a way that suits how you like to work, how much you want to work, how much you want to make, the kind of work that energizes you, and leverage, right? So if you have a specific niche and you're working across multiple businesses, then clearly your knowledge is able to compound. And if you solve the problem once, you can probably apply it to multiple businesses in your niche. So yeah, no, so that's it really. I think that fractional work is something I'm really excited by. I'm seeing a lot more of it. I'm excited to meet more and more people doing fractional work. It gives you freedom. It gives you the opportunity to kind of really hone in on your areas of expertise and do work that energizes you. So I think all of that is really brilliant for where things are going in the industry and in the market. So if you're listening and you say to yourself, well, I've got over 10 years of experience, I've got a distinct expertise. I'm kind of been, I'm tired of my job. I've been tired of it for a little while, and I could actually do with working with multiple businesses and choosing how I work, etc. So if you're in that position, I would say that there are a few key things that you should definitely do. The first is to audit your expertise. So really be clear on areas that your expertise is deeper than the average person. Not don't look at what you've done a couple of times. Look at what you know that you can deliver with no hand holding, and you can just kind of hit the ground running, and you can spot things that need to be done, and you know who to pull in to be able to get it, get stuff done. If again, because fractional work tends to favor people with a lot of experience, don't just jump from your full-time role. I think that that's fairly obvious. I would definitely recommend trying it out. So see if you can do something part-time, if there's no conflict of interest with your current employer. But see if you can test it out, right? And just be sure that it's something you enjoy and that the market is actually buying what you're selling. If you can, I would definitely recommend talking to people that you know or that you come across on LinkedIn who are doing fractional work because they will share what's the good, bad, and ugly. And then, I think once you've done all of those things, I definitely think you need to think about making yourself visible in your industry, whatever that might mean. For most people, it's being on LinkedIn. And the thing to really work on LinkedIn isn't just about, random visibility, but about your market positioning. So that's really, really critical because if you're able to position yourself well, then the right clients will engage with you, and you'll be able to have incoming leads, right, for the sort of fractional work that you do. Um, and then, the other thing I would say is the point I made earlier, which is ensure that you have a financial runway, right? So definitely 6 to 12 months the more you can go towards 12 months, the better, of expenses before you consider jumping into fractional work. Because, just to give yourself a buffer, and a bit of a ramp time. So, if in terms of the sort of areas that fractional work is favoring right now, and I'm sure it will evolve. Um, if you're in if you're in finance, so like chief financial officer, finance director, if you're in the talent space like myself, head of talent, chief talent officer, COOs or director of operations, CTOs, that's a huge one, especially in the US, fractional CTOs or fractional tech directors. Those people are doing really, really well in the US at the moment, and hopefully that will grow in the UK as well. So I think that those are all areas that are really emerging alongside fractional work. I didn't say marketing, so fractional CMOs, that's another growth area as well. So, yeah, I hope you found all of this useful. I love talking about alternative ways of working. I think that is the future of work. Um, I got introduced to fractional work recently, but certainly I've been talking about portfolio careers now for a number of years, and I'm definitely going to do a video on that coming up soon. So, yeah, this isn't to say fractional careers are better than full-time jobs, because there are definitely trade-offs for either. But it's just to say it's a different one. And if working in a full-time role hasn't worked for you so far, then maybe this is something that you need to consider. So yeah, thank you so much for watching today's video. Definitely, if you're somebody who's interested in working for a hedge fund, I've got a video on that, on how you can get into hedge funds and the things to think about that nobody ever talks about. But until then, I'll see you on my next video. Thank you.